This video has been sponsored by Describe. More on that later. Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So, proficiencies, armor, light armor, medium armor, shields. Druids will not wear armor or use shields made of metal. One thing I can count on whenever I make a video where druids are discussed is when I go to the comments, we're going to be discussing this wording from the player's handbook. So, druids will not wear armor or use shields made of metal. But what happens if they do? Hi, if you'd like to support the content on this channel, please check the link to my Patreon in the video description. Patrons of this channel receive rewards like early access to these videos without the YouTube ads, and my top level patrons can join me and play some D&D every month. Today I'd like to thank these top level patrons: Cass Byrne, Christian Wyndham, Unknown Watcher, Craig Locklear, Dank Train, Dash Panther, Dave Peters, David F., David Lotz, David Oliveira, and David W. Skibbins. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. Imagine our character for a moment. His long, braided hair tangled with leaf and twig. The fur-garbed druid regards a steel breastplate. His face, painted with striking blue designs, contorts in a pained focus. His gaze passes over the gleaming armor again and again, some inner battle waging behind his creased brow. There it is, a piece of metal armor that would increase this druid's armor class probably by a couple points. He is proficient in this armor. The player's handbook says he won't wear it. But is that up to the player's handbook? What about the player? Can the player just decide for themselves whether their character puts it on? And most importantly, what happens if they do exactly that? These are some comments I received on a single druid video I did not long ago. I feel like I'm hearing people say druids cannot wear metal armor more often. The player's handbook specifically states will not rather than cannot, implying a choice rather than a prohibition or restriction. There is no mechanical penalty for wearing metal armor either. It really just seems to be an evolution of the 3.5 druid restriction, which was a real restriction and had mechanical penalties for doing so. I just throw out the metal armor restriction in my games. It's a relic and makes no sense. For me, the druids won't wear metal armor reads the same to me as only elves can be blade singers or paladins must be lawful good. It feels like an arbitrary, traditional limitation that I don't enforce on anybody. I let my druids at the table use metal armor if they give me a compelling reason for the character to do so. After all, it only says won't use, not can't use. But that is just my mindset on the matter. I mean, I think we kind of get the picture here. So, is it a D&D 3.5 restriction? Well, yeah, it was. In fact, 3rd edition and 3.5 actually say the exact same thing. A druid who wears prohibited armor or wields a prohibited weapon is unable to use any of her magical powers while doing so, and for 24 hours thereafter. So in 3rd edition and 3.5, a druid player can put on metal armor or wield a metal shield, but if they do so, they can't cast their spells. I don't remember players getting angry about this restriction in 3rd edition, nor do I remember them calling it a relic. I think that's because in that edition, the consequences of wearing metal armor were just spelled out for you right on the page. The way 5th edition reads, there's no consequence listed, and if it's not listed, then some players feel that, therefore, there is no consequence. But this goes back further than 3rd edition. I pulled out my very old 1st edition player's handbook to see what it said about druids and armor. Druids are unable to use any armor or shields other than leather armor and wooden shields. Metallic armor spoils their magical powers. So we have the same restriction here, but the consequences of ignoring the restriction are less defined, though apparently interfering with their magic is still the theme. 2nd edition is actually the closest in wording to 5th edition. According to the 2nd edition entry, unlike the cleric, the druid is allowed to use only natural armors, leather armor, and wooden shields, including those with magical enhancements. All other armors are forbidden to him. But just like with our current edition, it says that it's forbidden, but it doesn't say what happens if we ignore that. It's just a breastplate, really, and some other pieces, and a helmet. Iron, it's made from the earth, right? The leather straps, those are from animals. The plate is embossed with a deer, elk, something with hooves and antlers. Wool lining, yes, from sheep. This armor doesn't look so intimidating, although even imagining a hand trapped in one of those gauntlets puts a mean twitch in one eye. So here's the question. Does the player's handbook get to tell you how to play your character? Certainly, it can impose restrictions. When your barbarian runs out of rages, then you don't get to choose to rage. You just can't. But it's not written that after a barbarian rages twice, they won't rage again until they take a long rest. I mean, it's clear. Once the rages are gone, they're gone. The player's handbook does do some other role-playing suggestions, though. I mean, look at the cleric. According to the player's handbook, for those evildoers who will benefit most from a mace to the head, clerics depend on their combat training to let them wade into melee with the power of the gods on their side. So, does your cleric have to wade into melee? I think we would agree that this text isn't intended to impose a restriction. It's instead describing how you might choose to play your cleric. It's flavor text, not mechanical text. So, what's the difference with that and the player's handbook saying that a druid won't wear metal armor? According to a commenter on one of my videos, there is no difference. Apparently, the inhibition to wearing armor is a flavor thing rather than a mechanics thing. You can totally wear armor made out of metal. So, is that true? Is the inhibition to wearing metal armor a flavor thing? Well, now we have to discuss how the player's handbook is put together. When we have a class listing, we always start with the flavor text. What is a druid? How do they normally act? How do you role play as a druid? This part of the class description is intended to give you some ideas and to explain what the intended theme is of the character class. But it's not intended to pigeonhole you into that theme, though. The mechanics of a class start right here. Once we get into class features and our class advancement chart, those are the mechanics that tell us the rules for playing this character class. And that's the thing. The mechanics of the druid are what tell us they won't wear metal armor. So does that mean there's some kind of mental condition that they just can't overcome? Some kind of phobia that they can't put on this armor? What happens if we, as a player of our druid character, tell our DM we put on metal armor? Do they say, you try to put it on, but you're unable to do so? If a vegetarian chooses to eat meat, is there some force preventing them from doing that? No. And why not wear it? My father toiled in that forge while I ran off into the forest, leaving him alone with my mother. But now, as his last act on this earth, he leaves me this. Something to keep me safe on the adventures I thought he despised. So damn my creed. What are some ancient superstitions when compared to the true love of a forgiving father? This is not some simple breastplate. This is the last embrace of a man I shunned all too quickly, a man who deserved a more loving son. Embrace me, father. What we have here is a restriction that is phrased as a character choice. But if we control our character, can't we choose otherwise? Now, if it said something similar to previous editions, that druids won't wear metal armor because their magic is screwed if they do, and here are the mechanics to how that works, then I don't think we would constantly discuss this. Players want their druid to have a better armor class, but they're not willing to give up their spellcasting to get it. But instead we have this restriction that is phrased like it's the character's choice, and there are no consequences listed, just like in 2nd edition, and it's written like there's this assumption that as a player, you're going to allow the player's handbook to tell you how to play your character. I think it is reasonable to say that something could happen if a Druid player chooses to break this restriction, but unlike with Paladin Oaths, which similarly tell you in the actual class features how you will play your character, those tell us what might happen if we don't. Except in this case, there is no guidance for the DM as to what the consequences will be, or even if there are consequences. And so why is that? D&D players ask the designers, what are the consequences to a druid who wears metal armor? On March 21st, 2016, the lead designer of the 5th edition Player's Handbook, Jeremy Crawford, responded. His response remains in sage advice to this day. The smell of charred meat and scorched hair hangs heavy in the air. A small crowd gathers outside the smithy, muttering amongst themselves in hushed, worried tones. Did you see it happen? Someone asks. A flash of green light, a strangled cry, and then he was just gone. The unfortunate druid's corpse smolders at the center of the crowd, a charred mass of burnt remains and blasted metal peeled outward like the petals of a wilted flower. A skeletal arm hangs fused to the breastplate, the only hint that the pile of ashes and blackened bones was once a person. He's melted, an onlooker intones in an odd whisper. Exploded, more like, another replies. Jeremy Crawford begins his response. The druid explodes. Well, not actually. Then Jeremy Crawford basically tells us that druids choose not to wear metal armor, and his assumption is that as a player, you'll simply understand that part of choosing to play a druid involves you accepting this. He adds that if you think it's unfair to be forced into this decision and you, and I quote, feel strongly about it, then you can talk to your DM. He adds that the story elements of classes are stronger in some classes than others, which is presumably why the Armor Taboo and Paladin Oaths are placed in the class features rather than in the flavor text. He then says it's up to the DM what happens if your druid puts on metal armor, going as far to say that maybe you won't be a druid anymore if you do. But that decision lies with your DM, and basically he's not going to give us any guidance on that. So if we put this all together, can a druid wear metal armor if the player chooses to ignore the restriction? Well, according to the lead designer of the Player's Handbook, you as a player don't get to make that decision. Ultimately, the DM can choose to make an exception, but that's no different than the DM choosing to make an exception on how many rages a barbarian gets per long rest, or any other rule for that matter. But as a player, the rules say that druids won't wear metal armor, so if you're a druid, you won't wear metal armor, and that's that. Okay, so those are the rules, at least as explained by the lead designer of the Player's Handbook. But are they good rules? In my opinion, no, they suck. The Player's Handbook telling you how you have to play your character class isn't new. It is definitely not new in 5th edition. These kinds of restrictions have been around as long as tabletop role-playing. But thankfully, we have been moving away from it. Druids used to have to also be neutrally aligned. Originally, you had to be true neutral only. Then it softened to at least one aspect of neutrality, and then finally the restriction was gone altogether. The armor thing, though, that's a little different because that actually applies a mechanical penalty, since a druid will have lower armor class because of the restriction. So if you just remove the restriction, you aren't just changing how somebody might roleplay a druid, you're boosting the power level of the class. And I don't think that would break the game, but I do have to say, if you're going to start boosting the power level of classes, personally, I wouldn't recommend starting with full casters. But would I force a player to follow the restriction? No, I wouldn't. I don't believe in those kinds of rules. But I will say, just because the rules don't list a consequence doesn't mean there isn't one. The reason the rules don't list a consequence to putting on metal armor is because the assumption is that you will follow the restriction. So if I'm going to allow players to break that restriction, then I need to think about what that consequence would be. Because the rules not listing a consequence in no way implies that there isn't one. Because we have the lead designer of the player's handbook basically telling us why there's no restriction listed. Because, according to him, you basically have to follow the restriction unless your DM house rules it. So if you have to follow the restriction, then listing a consequence to not following it becomes irrelevant because you don't get to make that decision. So that's why there's no consequence listed. So if we're going to change the rules so that players get to make their own decisions, then we need to fill in those gaps that the designers left there because they wrote a rule that you were forced to play your character a certain way. So when we assume that there's no consequence because there's no consequence listed, we're missing the basic point that the designers don't think you get to make that decision. So to fix that, there needs to be some kind of consequence, or we need to boost the Druid class. Those are our two options. I want to thank Describe for sponsoring this video. Describe is a service that provides this beautifully boxed text, including the excellent examples of their work that they created for me specifically for this video. Describe offers literally thousands of options that you can find with a quick and easy search feature. Descriptions of pretty much every spell. If it's a spell in D&D, they've got it. Characters, locations, and every published monster you're going to find. They also have fully interactive maps available with descriptive text for each feature. I highly recommend them, but if the cost of the service is an issue, then I still recommend checking out their free version, which still provides a ton of content for you to use, and it's free of charge. If you do decide, though, to subscribe to their service, then make sure to use the coupon code TreantMonk for 10% off your subscription. A link has been provided in the video description, and I pinned a comment to the video with it as well. So I get asked by players whether their druid can wear metal armor. But, I mean, let's be honest here. Nobody is asking because they came up with this great concept, but it needs to be a druid and it needs to wear metal armor. And now this restriction is preventing me from role-playing the character I wanted to. It's not that. It's instead, I wonder if I can convince Chris to let me have a higher armor class on this druid. I don't get players of sorcerers asking if they can have more sorcery points, or players of wizards asking if they can use arcane recovery multiple times, but the druid question comes up constantly because it's phrased as a role-playing restriction instead of a mechanical one. But let's be honest, the reason they're asking the question isn't because they feel like their role-playing is being confined. They're asking the question because if their druid wore half-plate, they would have a better armor class and be more powerful. Players want the best options. And when you phrase something like druids won't wear metal armor, it feels like the best option is being kept from you. Well, if you say, if druids wear metal armor, this bad thing happens, then it is no longer the best option. So the player feels more empowered. So I am not of the opinion that druids need a mechanical boost. So my answer to those players is that no druids wear metal armor, and I will not tell them how to play their character. And I won't let the player's handbook tell them how to play their character either. But the actions you take with your character, as always, have consequences. Now, once I make it clear to my players that they can choose to ignore the restriction, but there will likely be consequences, then obviously the question becomes, so what happens if I do wear metal armor? And the way I answer that is, I just said, no druids wear metal armor. So if you wear metal armor as a druid, you're going to be the first. And how would your character know what happens if you're going to be the first? Which is kind of code for, I haven't decided, but I sure will decide if you slip on that sweet, sweet half plate. Thanks everyone. I'm going to be getting back into subclass rankings next week. But on the topic of druids, I've been doing druid spell analysis each Monday if you want to check that out. Until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.